Good morning, everyone, and thank you to everyone who has joined us this morning. I see from the chat that we have a number of people who are keen to get going, and that's exactly what we will do. First, introductions. To introduce myself, my name is Pria Chetty, and I work at a legal consultancy firm called EndCode. And what you will see on the logo on the sheet in front of you is also a banner for something called a society, which is something that we are trying to grow as a community of people that have important discussions on tech law and policy. For this morning's discussion, I think we're very focused on the 4IR Commission report and the reason for today's discussion and the context for today's discussion is that we know that President Ramaphosa recently received recommendations from the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And these recommendations were presented by the Minister Ndabeni Abrahams, on the 6th of August to the President. And these recommendations and the report was recently Government Gazetted and now is available to the public. And it's a substantial document, so there's quite a bit in terms of context and findings and recommendations and so on. And it's a substantial effort from a number of commissioners. The commission itself comprised leaders from private sector, from business, from civil society, from academia, and various other institutions. And they began their work around about May 2019, with the idea being that they would use a series of research and stakeholder engagements and a few other interventions to present what would be a kind of comprehensive view on where South Africa is in terms of its current status vis-a-vis the Fourth Industrial Revolution, what the current conditions are, what its prospects might be in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a question that a number of countries are asking, and also to look at what some of the challenges and constraints might be in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it did this using a series of international benchmarking exercises, looking at ideas and inspiration from other countries, also examining the roles of various actors, including the state and other institutional actors, and producing a series of recommendations that are housed in a few pillars, one being human capital, the others being artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, the provision of data to enable innovation, and examining future industries and preparation for that, as well as some of the infrastructure constraints, challenges, and opportunities. What comes next is, and that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion this morning, what comes next is the expectation that the various sectors will interact with the report and identify ways in which they can contribute to this national strategy. So what we are doing today is hopefully gathering some ideas and input that make that task just a little easier for those of us that need to apply our minds to our role in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Now, what's really interesting about this and the reason that we are hosting this discussion is because in this 4IR strategy and conceptualization, what we see is that tech has been placed at the center. So concepts of digital transformation and inclusion are really core to how we see the 4IR unfolding in South Africa. And to quote the president, digital transformation has to be harnessed to change the way we live, learn, work, and govern. And so this discussion that we're having today is really with that context and keeping that in mind in terms of the power and importance of tech. I also want to introduce our speakers. I'll start with Nerushka Bowan. She's described by many as very inspiring, and she's certainly very inspiring to me. She's a specialist in emerging technology law. She's an international speaker. She's the founder of the LITT Institute that has a mission to catalyze change in the legal industry. And when it comes to topics such as blockchain and the Internet of Things and robotics and so on, Nerushka is the go-to lawyer on those issues. Then we have Sizwe Snail, who's known to many who have joined us this morning. He's the founding attorney of his firm, Snail Attorneys. He's got a very inspiring background. There's Sizwe. He's a very accomplished academic, a part-time member of the information regulator. He's a coordinator of multiple international committees and councils on cyber law and a number of e-law topics. He's the co-editor of the cyber law textbook, which is foundational still for a number of students who study cyber law for the first time. He's an international speaker. He was very prominent in the ICT review, and I participated where he has headed up some of those discussions. And then Enrico, I think also known to many who have joined us today, an experienced researcher, program manager, instrumental in so much of the influential research that we see in South Africa on internet measurements. He's the co-director at the moment of the Cybersecurity Centre for Southern Africa, the C3SA. Is involved in a number of projects, instrumental also in research design and implementation, the chair of the research committee of the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise. So as I said, the focus for this panel is really to go into some of those aspects of technology, data, some of the opportunities, constraints, reflections, recommendations, and hopefully in that way break this beast of a report into something that is understandable and makes sense to us. So to start today's discussion, that's about as much as you'll hear from me in a long monologue. So to start today's discussion, I just want to ask the panelists, what does 4IR mean to you? We know that there is the WEF definition, and we know that South Africa has introduced a variation of that is human-centered. What does 4IR mean to you? And how has it featured in or impacted the work that you're doing? We can start in any order, but maybe let's go in order of Nerushka, Sizwe, and then Enrico.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Pria, for that introduction. So what does the 4IR mean to me? Well, for me, it really has quite a big meaning, the fourth industrial revolution. I think a lot of people think it's just some kind of marketing gimmick or you know, just another tech buzzword that's going to die off pretty soon. But I do think it does have some real meaning. And what it for me means is it's going to create real transformative change in our day-to-day lives. You know, we have already experienced various industrial revolutions in the past, which have brought with them different types of change. But what's special about the fourth industrial revolution is these things called emerging technologies. And, you know, emerging technologies is really something that's piqued my interest and something that I've really focused on in my career, because as we see emerging technologies enter the market, you know, you look at things like the Gartner's hype cycle and things like that with regards to development and adoption. You know, it starts off in such a way that people think, you know, this is not really going to have any impact. It's just a phase, it's just a fad. And before you know it, a particular piece of technology has really embedded itself everywhere in all walks of life. And the theory is that as we move forward, these technologies will become even more transformative, even more life-changing, and even more pervasive, and will also be adopted at faster rates. So if you look at any kind of graph that tracks, you know, adoption of technologies over a period of time, you know, you can go all the way back to like the introduction of things like motor vehicles, and it will show you, you know, to reach like 50 million users, it took, you know, close on 60 decades. So by the time we got to 50 million users, you know, regulatory and law and policy had time to adapt, you know, okay, these are the risks about having vehicles on the road, you know, and slowly over time, regulation kind of had this reactive effect where it adapted as things happened. What's happening now is that, you know, that timeline for reaching 50 million users and more is closing and shortening every single day. So we've had Twitter, which reached 50 million users in kind of 2 years. And then we had Pokemon Go, which reached 50 million users in 2 days. And then you're looking at newer technologies, things like TikTok, which the younger generation, you know, are kind of living off, and these things are then, which are not understood because they come from different societies, and people think, oh, you know, they're harvesting our information and it's being sold to people who may not have good intentions. So the US government even tried to ban TikTok, but that did not succeed. So we're seeing this real struggle between technologies entering the market, people not really analyzing what effect the technology is going to have on society, what are the legal, regulatory, and ethical implications, and not addressing that upfront, because we can't wait to be reactive in the society we have anymore. We actually have to be proactive when it comes to regulation, and that's really a big mind shift from a regulatory and policy perspective. So for me, 4R has a huge meaning. You know, these are very important questions that I love to think about, talk about, and debate. So, and it's really impacted my work, as these are the issues that I do spend time you know, learning about myself and educating others. So that's my take on it.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Nerushka. I think later in the discussion, we'll pick up on what you said about the need to be proactive rather than reactive. Sizwe, opening comments from you.
Morning, morning Pria, morning panel, morning everybody who's come to this event this morning. For me, the topic of fourth industrial revolution has always been a very contentious topic, because as Nerushka was saying, you know, at some stage it looked like a marketing gimmick. It looked like it was a big policy noise-making mechanism for change towards technology. And this change towards technology is something that's been happening over the last 20 years. But with that having been said, the value of the fourth industrial revolution for us in particular now, you know, in this age of data communication, in this age of having to process big data in terms of analytics and also the protection of personal information when it comes to data protection regimes, it has just made the whole industrial revolution, as we call it per se, the digitized industrial revolution. You know, instead of calling it the fourth IR, I'll just call it the digitized revolution, because that's exactly what has happened. And we've been part and parcel of this digital revolution. I mean, it's always fascinating to be at platforms like this, to meet with other colleagues, other visionaries who have also seen the need to protect, you know, the legal aspect or the policy aspect of the data and how data is used to enhance our lives. So yeah, I think I'm saying a mouthful. Let me give over the baton to someone.
Thanks, Enrico. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, thank you, Priya, and hi, everyone. I think I can say good morning, because probably we are all in the same time zone, unless we have somebody actually joining us from other areas of the globe. So what I would like to answer to your question: what does the fourth industrial revolution mean for me? For me, as a researcher, as a digital policy researcher, because somehow it has impacted my work in a number of ways. And I think what would be interesting to see is whether it has impacted my work as expected by the report of the commissioners on the fourth industrial revolution. So my work at Research ICT Africa in the past has been characterized primarily on an understanding of policy and regulatory issues of telecommunications markets that have been primarily regulated at the national level, based on international standards standards. And for that, we have an international standard body. The ITU is the main one that, you know, has set a number of standards in terms of radio frequencies and allocation of spectrums. But then it was up to the different member states, you know, address issues of regulation to improve competition in the market, so that, you know, the main goal and policy objective in that kind of environment was to achieve universal access to ICT. And that has been the primary goal, especially also in developing countries, because some of the research informing that kind of objective had basically it was what it was believed is that ICT had a developmental potential, and increasing access to ICT would have improved level of GDP in specific country, because, you know, with the potential of creating a number of jobs and improving transparency, information processes, and all the benefits, you know, coming from their multiplier and network effects from connectivity. What we have observed, you know, as we actually have been conducting this study, is that also, you know, the number of users, for instance, accessing to the telecommunications infrastructure have increased, and especially in South Africa with the mobile phone. You know, we know that there is almost 100% level of use of the mobile phone. There are still a number of inequalities and gaps that have not been fulfilled yet. They've not been bridged yet. So what we are seeing is that you know, the gap between not only those that can access to the digital infrastructure and those that can't access is only of physical nature, but actually it's becoming more you know, related to what people can really do with ICT. How can they really benefit out of it? Is there really economic and social benefits from using ICT? And is it really improving the you know, the situation from an economic point of view? Do we see a reduction in poverty? Do we see better access to a number of services? No, those are some of the issues that basically are of interest for us. And the fourth industrial revolution as having, let's call it fourth industrial revolution just because we're using this term. I'm not gonna now discuss whether it's the correct one or it's not the correct one. I'm just calling like that because the report refers to that, as you said, from a definition provided by the World Economic Forum. But as technology is becoming more and more pervasive, so these kind of inequalities are increasing because meaningful connectivity is not actually still for everybody. What we have seen is that the telecommunication sector is growing in a platform economy where there are big monopoly that are able actually to attract to their shore resources, skills, and a number of assets that actually allow them to provide services for the entire population, but in incredibly highly globally concentrated market that somehow are also replacing some of the functions of providing digital public goods that, you know, they might have been in the hands of public sector informations. Now, especially in developing countries, are entirely delivered from the private sector. Probably the public sector, we can maybe discuss what it still is role, but it seems that, you know, also for a number, I don't know, the provision of traditionally public goods like ID is now provided through these new models of public-private partnerships between private sector and private organizations. So also, you know, for this kind of services, we see that there is a increasing integration between the two sectors. So my research, of course, is becoming incredibly more complex and has shifted the interest also from a donor's point of view, right? The main interest at the beginning was really to try to understand issues of digital access, very relevant for developing countries. Now is becoming more, instead of understanding what's the impact of these new technologies, for instance, AI, on society and on other sectors. So there is really a shift of interest. I believe that this narrative around the fourth industrial revolution has shifted the focus also from a donor point of view. And a very interesting point also from Nerushka on the emerging technology and on the focus of technology. Well, an interesting shift that I've seen from the past is that before countries were somehow and other actors making assessment of technology purely from an efficiency and market point of view. If you're seeing how actually the cyber policy narrative instead is evolving, there is a very important and interesting political component as well. And that's what we have seen, for instance, with the 5G, Huawei, decisions on the assessment of the technology. The technology has not been assessed purely from a technological risk point of view, but there has been really an emerging kind of political decision that is made from from the assessment of whether a technology actually should be adopted or not. I think this is an interesting aspect that we are seeing in this so-called fourth industrial revolution that might have repercussion actually on how our markets will work, and of course on dynamics of power. And then, of course, another interesting aspect is that in my work, to try to understand ICT for development, the focus is not only any longer the developmental aspect of the technology and therefore also the benefits, because as more and more people are using the technology, we have observed that there are a number of risks and threats actually as we use this technology. So it seems that the way we plan and we try to understand policy is involving more and more the risk assessment. And I think it is something also we have seen in front of all of us, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The decision making has been really done based on a risk assessment of the situation. And it seems that also from a technological point of view, trying to understand what are the systemic risks of using the technology is becoming, in a number of countries, of growing countries, a priority. I think it would be now interesting to see also whether in this report, actually, the risk assessment of the fourth industrial revolution is considered a priority, or if there is something more that we should do in that respect. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico, for that. And I think what you were pointing to in terms of this indication of priority areas, or the kind of themes that will be increasingly more relevant over the next few years. I think that's the sense we're getting from what we're seeing. Say what we may about the report. I think it's really useful as this kind of indicator of priority areas. Before we get into some of the detail of the report, I wanted your reflections because you're coming from different spaces. Sizwe from a kind of traditional cyber law perspective, Nerushka from the emerging tech space, Enrico coming from the connectivity side. Your sense when you read this report, does it recognize and align itself with the existing ICT policy and regulatory landscape that we have? And also curious, Nerushka, Enrico mentioned that this issue of the dominance of risk assessment type approaches to regulation. Are we doing enough in the way that the report is structured and looking at the regulation that we have to encourage the adoption of what we think will be transformative in the future from an emerging tech perspective? So keen to hear from you. Let's start with Sizwe, because you've been part of the ICT policy review. Does this 4R report situate itself adequately in the landscape that exists? It's throwing out all of the different references with the various policies and SA Connect, broadband, NDP, and so on. Where does it find itself, and also within the ICT policy and regulatory landscape and the other elements of it?
Yeah, I think, looking at the report generally, giving it a general overview, I think it touches on very important aspects that we need to face as a country, that individuals need to face in terms of connectivity, in terms of access to connectivity and generally access to the internet, as a whole. And with respect to that, I think the report does talk about the deficiencies that we have in Africa as a whole. What maybe I found a little bit disappointing was it doesn't connect so much with previous policies of our government. It doesn't connect so much with the legislation aspect. And maybe there one would have wanted a better connect between the policies, should I say, the old policies regarding ICT use, and how that links up now with this Fourth Industrial Revolution Commission that has been created. In other words, I'm not critiquing the document as a whole. I'm just saying it would have been nice if the document would have connected to what already existed, as well as connect with the legal framework. It's always nice to talk about cyber law, Cyber law, I guess, has been now in South Africa for the last, 25 years. When Reinhard Bass started the first textbook cyber law essay, I remember, Pria, you were working with Reinhard at the time. You guys were the pioneers of the law, of the cyber law at the time. And this has now developed. There's cases, there's new legislation, there's a whole lot of things that are happening. And it was just a little bit disappointing to see that the report doesn't connect to the law and how the law has dealt with legal technology development. So I think that's the issue that I would have raised from that perspective, from a legal perspective. And there's some issues that are important, like data protection, and I need to be careful how I'm going to talk about this one now. Data protection in itself is a key to a successful Fourth Industrial Revolution. From a security perspective, in other words, protecting the personal information, keeping it safe, having proper safeguards in place, and just generally, accepting the generally accepted principles of data protection. That is something I would have really liked to have seen link into that. I would have also liked to have seen the connect of cyber criminality vis-a-vis cybersecurity. I mean, we've just had now the new cyber crimes bill. Well, it's been there for a while, but finally, government is dealing with it, and it's going to become law. One would have loved to have seen the connect between these vital pieces of legislation, critical information infrastructure. South Africa is really advanced in drafting advanced and good legislation. But when you have commissions like this that undertake this type of work, it is always nice to see the legal connect and not just policy discussion. Once you talk too much policy, it ends up being just another policy document that will either be shelved or be shelved by the next administration that is coming. But let's leave it at that. Let me not twist my tongue. I think I've been careful enough to address how I feel about it. Thank you.
And I hear you, Sizwe, and I'm trying to make some recommendations as we go. And I think what's coming through very clearly from what you're saying is that shift from policy to legal as a way to kind of operationalize it. And Nerushka, on the emerging tech side, like I said, keen to hear whether you think there is this alignment with the frameworks, but also whether we have dealt with it from both sides, the risk side and the encouragement, promotion side for emerging tech.
I mean, firstly, just to kind of reiterate, the points that Sizwe Sizwe has just made, I think, you know, it would have been good to kind of, for the report to have reflected on some of the pieces of legislation that have been passed, you know, just to kind of make the document holistic. I mean, it talks a lot about things like use of data, the data policy, you know, doing this, doing that, and kind of a lot of forward-looking things without really acknowledging, you know, what has already been done. So I think I definitely want to reiterate that sentiment. I think, you know, if there is an updated draft to this, there should definitely be some kind of inclusion to acknowledge what has been done to date and what can also be applied in the future. Because I also think the creation of new policy, new legislation, and I think which is touched on in the report, is for me the last resort. You should always look at what instruments you have already available to you and see how they apply to the environment and to the future. And then perhaps make some kind of amendments if necessary to keep that document fresh and forward-looking. And then only if you feel, you know, it's really not fit for purpose and it really can't, you know, survive the future and what we're really looking at, that's when you should then enact something new as a last resort, because there's a lot of reasons for that. The one is, you know, policy is one thing, but legislation and regulation gets old very fast. And oftentimes, by the time it's written down and into force, you know, the technology and innovation has moved on. So if we ever try to regulate technology, which is also something commented on in certain places in the document, they talk about contemporary policy of technology, and other pieces of policy which should be technology neutral. I would always advise against policing the underlying tech, because the tech evolves at a very rapid pace, and no matter what you say, even, you know, they talk about smart law and innovation in regulation and, you know, increasing the speed, you know, it all sounds great, you know, in the world of utopia if we ever get there. But I really don't think we should try and fool ourselves into thinking we're going to live in that world where we can accelerate legislative process and things like that. So I think we should be practical and look at what we have already and how we can utilize that to really to its biggest benefit. Some other things that were missing from the fintech side, the regulators in the fintech field have been quite active. They established the IFWG, the Intergovernmental Fintech Working Group, you know, to look at things like innovation in financial services, adoption of fintech, things like crypto assets. They have you know, produced policy papers for things like crypto assets and possible regulation around those areas. And there was kind of no mention of any of those developments from the financial services side. So I think, you know, a more inclusive report that really touches on what we've already been doing as a country would really be useful. In terms of a risk-based approach, you know, I think we should be moving away from you know, black and white kind of letter of the law type legislation, do this or do that, or you're not compliant, and more towards outcomes-based, risk-based guidelines, frameworks, ethical compliance, governance. We want people to do the right thing at the end of the day. That is the outcome. We don't want people to abuse technology. We don't want abuse of data. We don't want abuse of human rights. And that's really the target. But having very, very kind of specific laws, we end up in a tick box environment where people just kind of like, I just have to tick these 3 boxes and then I'm compliant with all the laws. So I think we do need to be careful of that. You know, one example of that would be the laws we have in the film and publication space. You know, the regulations go very specific into talking about DVDs and the size of the triangle, the blue triangle with the age restriction on the DVD. And now those same laws have to be applied to your Netflix and your Showmax. And that's causing a lot of, you know, kind of friction between the regulators and the players in that space, because the law was drafted in the 90s without any thought of, you know, the kind of world that we live in today. So we do, you know, it's very difficult. Let me just say that I'm happy not to be a regulator trying to regulate the 4IR. So it's very easy to say, you know, what people should be doing and, you know, the things that are wrong and pointing holes. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually the solutions and you know, finding the right way to do things. And it doesn't matter where. It's not a South African problem. I think I want to also reiterate that point. This is a global problem, all the way from Silicon Valley. You know, the regulators in the US, in Senate, don't know how to regulate social media in Silicon Valley. They keep inviting them, you know, to have engagements and they interview the CEOs, but they still don't know how to properly regulate them. So it's definitely not a local problem. This is a global problem and a difficult one to solve at that. Thanks.
No, absolutely, Nerushka, and I think lots of support also from the chat. I see a number of recommendations also coming through on the chat that we'll reflect on shortly. Enrico, I want to ask you, because you have studied extensively the connectivity landscape, and so you would have heard all the buzzwords from an access perspective and every policy initiative and so on. Where does this 4IR report situate itself in that connectivity landscape, and how does it align with or interact with what exists in that landscape?
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So I think this is a very interesting question, and it's also linked to exactly, you know, to broader kind of situation, right, of the report. So where we are, you know, where is South Africa in terms of readiness for digital transformation, for digitalization, you know, technological innovation. And, you know, so Research Society Africa has done actually an extensive work and has analyzed, you know, the issue of policy and regulatory developments in the telecommunication sector, both historically, really, if you read our reports, there is the full history of that, and also vertically, you know, try to understand what are then the reasons why some of the policy documents have not been properly implemented, adopted. There are a number of processes that actually they get completely eliminated, you know, all of a sudden and without actually coming to fruition until the end. And, you know, so the report, I think it starts interesting. It has got very good intentions, because we should recognize, you know, the effort of actually trying to situate the fourth industrial revolution within the most pressing challenges of the country, you know, unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And there is acknowledgement of that, and, you know, the willingness of actually trying then to use technological transformation and innovation really as a, you know, as a way of overcoming the most pressing challenges of the South African society. But it is important to understand that in a process of digitalization and technological transformation, there is a need for some preconditions. So the report also mentions the study on unlocking the fourth industrial revolution by the African Development Bank. Research Society Africa was one of the research partner of that report. It's an interesting one, but our perspective on that was that we do need to prioritize the preconditions for the industrial revolution, because otherwise we are not ready. We do not have, you know, we would like, I don't know, to run a big race, but we do not have simply the means of doing that. So until we actually get the right means in place, and in a digitalization process is the telecommunications infrastructure, we will not be able actually to reap the benefits of emerging technologies. There is in the report a recurring theme on leapfrogging as well. I believe that it comes from the so-called, I don't know, miracle of, you know, connecting through the mobile phone in countries that didn't have a proper fixed line infrastructure. So, you know, differently from Europe, States, and other Western countries, Africa did leapfrog the connectivity aspect through the use of the mobile phone. But the emerging technology of the fourth industrial revolution are really based on good, reliable, affordable connectivity. Both from a price point of view, has to be affordable, not only for the citizens, and we know that the majority of people in South Africa are below the poverty line, as much as in other African countries, and other African countries even below, but also from as an input cost for small, medium, and micro enterprises. As we know, connectivity might, as such an important input cost, actually has to be somehow affordable. Connectivity has to be also reliable, and we conducted studies on measuring both the speed of broadband in South Africa, which is an important indicator, but the second one is also the latency, and so the kind of delay that the users receive when we use the internet. And latency becomes particularly important for this emerging technology because in a cloud-based kind of environment where you do not want to centralize all your data all together, because you create honeypot for criminal to actually go there and breach your databases if they are centralized. Your distributed kind of resources have to be accessed fast and with very low latency, especially also then if you want to use this data coming from different sources through this kind of computational, software and machines that are able to use different sources of data, and through AI providing you with different results or any kind of, things that you need. So infrastructure has to be then a good quality also from that point of view. In South Africa, we had a number of documents. There is South African Connect, but there is very lack of progress in terms of the implementation of that document. There have been a number of problems in implementing that. We have also the National Integrated ICT Policy White Paper. It's since 2016. But as a result of this document, little changes happen in terms of market regulation, in terms of prices, of quality of service. Those are things that actually haven't really happened. And I think regulation in regulating actually the telecommunication sector can be very, very effective. There has been also recently the broadband policy in 2013 and the Electronic Communications Amendment Bill. I was reading recently that actually that document now has been completely withdrawn. A number of stakeholders participated to that process, trying to improve, providing input and suggestion, and it's not there any longer. And then, of course, the issue of spectrum. So the document recognizes the importance of the 5G. But 5G is a well-known technology for Internet of Things, so for machine-to-machine kind of communications, and for really digitalizing, the entire environment. So it seems that it's very effective in highly populated, densely populated area, where of course there is a very good fiber infrastructure. And considering that urbanization is one of the global mega trends, probably is going to solve some of the needs of this growing population in the city. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that there are unconnected rural areas where still the majority of the African population live, and probably that technology won't touch that area. For this kind of areas, there are other existing technology, for instance, 4G, but that high value spectrum, again, in South Africa, has not properly been allocated, creating big bottlenecks in terms of connectivity. And third, in terms of connectivity, also there are a number of successful stories of using spectrum commons. And so, you know, on refarming spectrum, especially in rural areas, low densely populated areas, that also has been allocated, is actually not used. And there are regulatory bottlenecks to actually being able to use that kind of spectrum by small and medium enterprises for different reasons and for providing connectivity also in these areas. So I believe that, you know, we do have a number of documents, we do have a number of knowledge. So it's really a matter, I think, also of trying now to, you know, to bring in these aspects of actually trying then to connect, you know, the last billion, again, this developmental kind of narrative that has underpinned a number of these documents through the proper policy and regulation in terms of telecommunication. So we will then talk about also cyber, but I do not want to monopolize this discussion.
And thank you, Enrico. So much coming from that, and I think also some good responses on the chat. I see there's a reference in the chat to the sector diagnostic in the NDP Digital Futures report that that we have a post that says it's set out the current policy, institutional arrangements, legislation, and regulation, but also done a kind of gap analysis to see where we would fall short in the process of digitalization and so on. So I think a great resource there for those who are curious about the current landscape and where the gaps may be. And then also another comment that is being made about taking into consideration the location of the data centers, because naturally that affects the regulation that will apply. So I think good comments there. I noticed that each of you picked up on what wasn't in the report that you would have liked to have seen. And my next question is, if we had to think about who the key policy and regulatory actors are and what their roles will be. So what would you have liked to have seen? You mentioned, you know, the agenda and then the key themes, but what would we like to see as the role for instance, the information regulator, the cybersecurity structures, you know, and thinking about artificial intelligence also coming through prominently on the chat. It's an area of interest. Who would those key policy and regulatory actors be? And if we think about DCDT and ICASA, breaking it down and giving roles and responsibilities and seeing how they would bring this to life and operationalize this. Keen to hear some of your ideas on that. Nerushka, can we start with you? You also mentioned the working group that I think is, you know, has done substantial work in the fintech space. So bringing those key actors together, what would they do and what would they contribute in the context of this report?
So I do definitely think it's like a multidisciplinary approach when it comes to who's going to action the outcomes of this report. Obviously, government is going to play that driving force, and not just one area of government, but it will really cut across you know, a variety of different departments and things like that. And then it also will fall under the regulatory arm. And again, there's a variety of regulators that do play roles here. One thing the report does mention is trying to fix the overlapping. So already we have situations where either a piece of legislation, policy, or technology, and I think more recently, you know, with the more digital types of broadcasting, things like that, it's really overlapping the kind of regulatory thresholds of various players in the industry. So I think that was a good point to say, you know, we need to kind of define who's responsible for what, because what happens when there's potential overlap is that sometimes everybody takes their hands off and says, it's not me. And that's when we also have, you know, an issue. And then the other extreme is everybody says, but this is my piece of the pie, and then I need to regulate it. And then again, there can be friction created there. So I think, you know, that point about really identifying where the overlaps are and identifying who's responsible will assist in practical implication. Because if you don't give people kind of accountability and responsibility, then it's just, you know, a lovely document that we read and then it doesn't really go anywhere. So I think really getting down to that granular level is key here. And then they also talk a lot about the PPPs, or the public-private partnerships, throughout the document, and the potential there, you know, really for these partnerships to really drive a lot of the infrastructure development, the adoption of some of the technologies, you know. So I think there's also acknowledgement that it all can't come from you know, one area, or all can't come from government, but there really needs to be some kind of you know, cooperation as well. So I think it's really you know, it's cross-cutting in terms of who the stakeholders are. You can't really leave anybody out when it comes to this, because you know, it also, if you even leave technology aside for a second, you know, it goes all the way back to what are our core issues. And our core issues, you know, we cannot escape that no matter, you know, matter what. We still have to pay much attention to our issues when it comes to unemployment, our issues when it comes to poverty, our issues when it comes to the state of education in the country. And I think no matter how many, you know, great 4IR policies and tech policies we have, if we can't solve these three key issues, you know, we might as well not even start. So the report does identify those three key issues, but I don't think it yet marries how the 4IR is you know, kind of going to solve those issues, or you know, contribute there. But it does identify what our key issues are. So I think, you know, it really is cross-cutting when it comes to implementation. And I do hope when we get to that stage that the key issues are still front of mind, because the other problem is that if we don't keep those key issues in mind, we can just exacerbate the issues that are already there. So if we have, you know, kind of a pay gap or inequality or unemployment, we could just make those issues already worse. If we're only educating certain people and not other people, we could make the gap in education, we'll just make it worse. We'll make the poverty gap worse. So 4IR can be transformative in a good way, but it could also have the completely opposite devastating effect, where it's only a sector of population that is being serviced by this, and all the issues we already have in this country are just going to be made so much worse. And I often describe our country as a paradox. Like, we're just so excellent at so many things, and we're just also so bad at so many things, and we're doing it, you know, at the same time in parallel. You know, we can have, you know, for example, the sub-C, you know, people don't see it as innovative, but the sub-C is innovative. You can go and start a company completely online. You can buy and sell shares in the JSE completely online. People take it for granted in this country, but look at another first world country like Canada, for instance. Those documents, those shareholder documents, have to be a physical piece of paper. You know, from an administrative perspective, and from a security and risk perspective, how difficult that is. So we should actually be thankful for some of the things we have. You know, even our SARS, you know, we can actually file online, where in some countries you still have to go and fill in physical pieces of paper, and we take a lot of those things for granted. But at the same time, while we're having these innovations, we also have schools, you know, which have pit latrines that kids are actually dying inside. You know, it's mind-blowing and devastating at the same time. But we can't ignore the 4IR at the same time, because then we're also going to make all our problems worse. So we have to, you know, these are really complex issues, and we have to work together to solve them. We can't say it's only government's problem and the rest of us are hands off. It's really multidisciplinary.
Oh, absolutely, Nerushka. And I think what you brought home is such a human side to this. And I think that, you know, that's the point that's coming through from the guidance internationally, is that this isn't just about exciting tech or, you know, moving beyond the frontiers that we know. There's an opportunity to change life and society as we know it. Also, you know, also thinking about what you said about this prescription of accountability and responsibility, and it kind of in a kind of at least clear way, if not official way, so that we can move forward, that it isn't just a case of, you know, an appeal for hands on deck, that it gets a lot more real, and we do have a kind of reference for who does what and how we bring those contributions together. Sizwe, from your side, especially on the cybersecurity side, the work on cybercrime and privacy and the other actors, who comes to mind as needing to contribute to this, and what are the kinds of roles that you see for them?
Thank you. Thank you, Pria, for that question. You know, once again, it's that old problem that we've had in South Africa of silos. When the ECT Act came, it was the whole silo of the Department of Communications. Now of late, the Department of Justice is coming in with the cyber criminality thing. The Department of Justice has been spearheading data protection. So this thing of different silos is, I think, the main problem here. Because as a result of these different silos, a beautiful project such as this is not getting to the right people to give the right comments, to give the right input because of this silo mentality, you know? And the only way that one can actually deal with this properly is to have a look and say, who are the role players from a government perspective? What are the government departments that are driving certain things? And then when you have initiatives such as this, you ensure that all those government departments are in sync with the process. It's all nice to get a bunch of commissioners and a bunch of experts to come and draft a report that will talk on policy, you know? But if the report does not talk to the actual role players, then it is a problem. I mean, if you think about it, this particular report is seen as a report from the presidency. It's not a report from whatever department or that department. It's a report from the presidency. You know, so being such a report, one would have really hoped that all the role players, all the stakeholders, all the government departments, all the empowered regulators in terms of legislation, that they would have been more actively involved in this drafting process. Thanks.
No, absolutely, Sizwe, and I get the sense, you know, not just from this discussion, but also from discussions outside of this, that there is this, on the one hand, resilience, so the spirit of, you know, of resilience, and that, albeit that we are sitting in this paradox that Nerushka mentions, that there is a kind of willingness to step forward and help, that, you know, all is not lost, and there is an opportunity to participate and contribute. Enrico, I want to bring you in here, and also just to, you know, keeping in mind what's coming through from the other panelists, the broader nature of this, the way that it touches on humanity, and some of the ways in which this might disrupt the world of work. It might disrupt, you know, with specific consequences for women, and then also, you know, there are also some issues in there about how this 4IR is seen as kind of core to economic recovery and socioeconomic development, down to the level where there is a role in the 4IR approach to the eradication of violence towards women. So when we look at it that way, you know, who are the actors? And Sizwe mentioned this silo, you know, approach that we might be facing, but who do we need to draw in and, you know, and bring into this and establish those roles and responsibilities that Nerushka mentioned? Who do we draw in?
Yeah, thank you, Priya. This is a very interesting question and extremely difficult to answer, because I think it's also at the core of you know, on how then to reflect on the developmental potential of technology and what's the impact on human, I would say, human security. If we take that kind of risk perspective and harm perspective of technology. And so I think that it's very interesting to see that, you know, the report is actually it comes from the presidency, and I do agree with that approach, because I think that there is a recognition that digitalization is, although it is still addressed in siloed, as Sizwe was saying, there are a number of departments that actually do not communicate with each other. Also, they are more and more dealing with digital issues. They are still siloed, but I think there is an intention in this report to really see digitalization as a cross-cutting issue across a number of departments, and so also the aspect of risks and harm of digitalization. It's something that cannot be addressed any longer only from a specific department that historically has dealt with the telecommunications regulation and broadcasting. So, for instance, in South Africa, we have seen a problem with the cybersecurity hub. So there has been a recognition then, you know, from the national national cyber policy framework. There were too many responsibilities within newly established entity that was sitting under the wrong department, who does not deal with security historically. It's not under, you know, its expertise. Has been dealing with completely different issues, and so, you know, this need of moving it around between then the police or state security agency, simply because cybersecurity has got issues related to the confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of the information, but you can see somehow a role played also by the intelligence, but not exclusively. And of course, then also justice, probably to try also to recognize the issue of rights, you know, security also as a right issue, and the problem actually with access to justice, right? To then try to criminalize unlawful activity on the internet. Now, with the criminal on the internet, that's unfortunately is not sufficient. And again, in this multi-stakeholder approach that has been, you know, recognized in the report, both in the drafting, because we have involved a number of stakeholders, and in the implementation, it is clear that they would like to pursue a multi-stakeholder approach. And my feeling is that what is missing is the rights component. So the framework. The report discusses legal, ethical, and regulatory issues that are very, very important. But there is these rights, human rights, people rights, to dignity, to security, to education, and others. I probably on education there is. But on security, it is not as strong as probably it should be. And I think it is important because in that way it recognizes that you know, technology has got both this developmental potential and also these very good things, but also the negative aspects actually impact on human rights, on rights, you know, of dignity, of feeling safe online, not need to be harassed, or, you know, of a proper or, you know, really feeling comfortable while you are online. Addressing this issue now again, it is not any longer responsibility exclusively of government, simply because the government entities are not able to regulate global platforms that do operate on a global scale and not only nationally. So there are a number of jurisdictions that are implicated, and human rights also create some sort of protection for a number of platforms on actually, keeping freedom on the internet, and on how actually some of these platforms should be used by number of users. The highly controversial freedom of expression right I'm referring to. Now, another interesting discussion that in any case we are having on the regulation on the internet is that there is existing law that does apply in cyberspace, internationally recognized as the humanitarian law and human rights law. The United Nations have, recognized that through multilateral decisions. And the question is how. I think at the national level we have constitutions, and the constitutions do apply in an online space. And those somehow create the boundaries on what are people's rights and what are also the obligations, and what proper behavior actually also online should be, because in order not to interfere with some others people freedom and rights. Now again, regulating this from the national to international becomes extremely complex and cannot be done only by governments, but really platforms and the private sector needs to come on board, and they do have to set some sort of rules. That has been done by a number of platforms through community guidelines. That have really emerged through discussions and inputs of different users. But considering the such a high number of actually users using this kind of platforms, it is very difficult to police, let's say what they say. Also, police is not the right term, but somehow to identify what is a correct behavior and what it's not. So there has been done now increasingly use of algorithm to somehow try to identify, speech that is not appropriate or is racist or is violent. Algorithmic regulation does have big problems from a number of points of view. One for all, we do not have enough data points from developing countries. So probably, the algorithmic regulation is based on standards and principles from Western countries that might not meet the needs of developing countries. And there is a problem also, as we have said, of accountability. So within this very complex space, this multi-stakeholder approach is somehow recognized as the right one to pursue. I've been myself supportive of this process. But at the same time now, when I try to dig into specific legal and policy issues, for instance, cybersecurity, I do recognize the complexity also of that kind of arrangement. And we had some discussions on this kind of proactive approach to regulation instead of reactive, whether our legal system is actually able to keep up with the transformation of technology, and how should we approach that? And I believe that unfortunately regulation is not able to keep up with that, because technology innovates and changes itself faster than our legal processes. So there are actually some new ways of actually doing that are emerging. And I think an example is from the work that is done now at the UN level through the open-ended working group on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. They deal with disarmament issues and try to conflict prevention and to maintain peace and stability, considering that this new domain, cyberspace, can really become a space for cyber warfare and countries. Now, in order to keep peace, stability, and responsible state behavior, countries, on one hand, they agree that international humanitarian law and human rights law apply to cyberspace. They try to understand now how it works. So it seems that there is probably to modify that kind of regulation, but a good, strong rights-based regulation does exist in the offline world, and probably we need to understand how does apply into the online world. Secondary, another approach is through voluntary, non-binding norms on responsible state behavior on cyberspace that touch upon a number of critical issues, to keep and maintain our digital environment safe and secure. They cut across critical infrastructure protection, responsible responsible reporting on vulnerabilities, application of human rights, and so on and so forth. Those are 11 norms that at the moment are still voluntary and non-binding. Why? Because they want to give the possibility of different countries now to understand how to observe these norms that have been agreed globally, because there is a need of global cooperation and understanding at the national level. So, really to give them time to understand what the policy, regulatory, and legislative constraints might be and what is needed, at the national level. And an approach also that has been pursued to try then to test some of these emerging regulatory and legislative approaches is through regulatory sandboxes that it seems that have been suggested, for instance, in other regions, in the ASEAN region, to try to understand controversial issues linked to, for instance, cross-border data flow, right? It's difficult to understand whether existing legislative measures are enough, and conducive for a safe and rights-based approach to cross-border data flow, right? That protects the privacy of the citizens. So an approach for doing that, to test some of these emerging legislative and regulatory framework is actually through these regulatory sandboxes that have been also applied in the cybersecurity space. And I think those are a very good way, because it's possible actually to have at the same table different government departments brought from a policy point of view, from a legal point of view, from a technical point of view, and let them test, some of these regulatory and legal aspects in a setting that actually is a mock, is an example. But it really allows them to understand issues of responsibility, of roles, and what should be done better and what not. Another instrument that I think is a very valid one, and we are actually trying also to pursue that, is through conducting cyber maturity assessment, which are very comprehensive exercise and looking at different aspects of cyber maturity of a country. So, a country is assessed in terms of the policy and legislative framework, education and culture, standards, adoption of standards in regulating cyberspace, data protection law, and so on and so forth. So really try to understand where the country is in terms of, who is responsible for what, where we are, how mature we are in terms of these different components, and identify specific points of policy recommendations. So I think there are a number of instruments, beyond the classic kind of traditional legal process.
Thank you for that, Enrico. And I think it was a very useful cautionary to also say that we don't want to end up in a situation where we have over-prescribed roles and responsibilities. And so probably what's a good starting point is to analyze what the existing roles and responsibilities, either through the statute or secondary legislation and regulation and so on, to try and work out what is it that people do already. There's also a comment that's come on the chat to say that even when we take something like cybersecurity, there are a number of roles already prescribed within different departments for certain risk mitigation measures and reporting of incidents and so on. And so I think, there is that existing roles and responsibility structure, but perhaps what we need to do is bring that closer to the report. Now, a burning question, because we allowed participants to this discussion to suggest what they would like to hear from the panelists, a burning question was around the regulation of artificial intelligence. And so, Nerushka, I'm sure you have studied this to the max, and Sizwe, I know your excitement on the topic as well. So from the context of the report, looking at what's happening internationally, lots of developments, and I see, Enrico also mentioned that humanitarian element that comes through with some of this emerging tech. What's your recommendations on how South Africa should look to put some kind of regulatory structure in place for artificial intelligence? Should we put a regulatory structure in place, and what should that look like?
So, I mean, artificial intelligence is, yes, one of my favorite topics to talk about. It's really one of those ones where you can have interesting debates. Everybody has very strong opinions when it comes to AI. The report goes on a lot about something called the AI Institute and establishment of an AI Institute. It talks about perhaps putting it, under an existing institution. It's not obviously a concrete plan. It's more very, very high level idea about the AI Institute. And I think that also derives from when they looked at what other countries were doing. Many had in some form or the other some kind of AI policy or body that was purely focused on the development of AI. And it's kind of a twofold approach. The one is increasing capacity and resource to actually develop AI and AI applications and AI-based technology locally, so that we can actually have homegrown tech as opposed to always importing tech developed elsewhere. So that's the one arm. And then the second arm is obviously then the policy, regulatory, and legal aspect. So now that we have the tech, how do we deal with it? And this is really, where a lot of the debates start. And I think it also depends on what your definition of AI really is. So the way I like to describe it, and the way I understand it, when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's really giving non-human things human attributes. So as soon as we start applying some kind of human attribute to something that's not a human, we can start to say that it has some kind of level of AI. So for some examples, if you're looking at autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles, they need the ability to kind of see what is around them, hear, other vehicles, or hear the environment, and then navigate that in a safe way. Now, because it has those kind of human elements, we can kind of say that autonomous vehicle has AI. If you're looking at robotics, some robots now are starting to learn how to walk and engage and almost feel, so it can touch things and learn how to open doors, and that kind of sense of touching and feeling again is something that's a human attribute. And then we would say these robots now are starting to have artificial intelligence. And then when we come to computers and software and machine learning and things like that, really what's happening behind the scenes is coding or algorithms or software being written. And these algorithms are written in such a way that once it's been fed information, or once it's actually left out there to explore, it starts to make its own conclusions, start to make its own findings that were not perhaps programmed upfront by a human. And once it can start doing that, then we say, okay, now it's moving into the realm of AI, because it's actually making decisions or making findings or doing things that we didn't actually program it upfront to do. After it's read all of this data, or it's gone out and found this information, it's been able to do that. Other examples are there's AI that can play chess, for example. So that's quite a high level logic based game. And therefore, once that AI becomes big enough, smart enough to kind of beat the grandmasters at this game, we can say that's a very smart level of machine AI. So where is AI going in the future? And again, this is a big area and a topic for debate. If you read some of the kind of future forecasts, at present, AI has not taken over the level of intelligence of the human brain. So if we look at the smartest computer today, although on certain aspects, for example, computing power of mathematical equations and things like that, a human could never compete with a computer. But however, in other aspects, more less tangible aspects, more like the creative side, things like that, more high-level thinking type things. AI hasn't reached the level of humans yet, but it's only a matter of time before we can say find AI that will be at the equal level of humans. And the reason for that is they're some of the smartest minds in the world that are actively trying to create AI, whether they're at Google or Facebook or wherever they are actively trying to solve that problem. And once they do, the supercomputers of the future won't be built by humans. The supercomputers of the future will be built by other AI, because humans, our development kind of stops at a certain level. So the IQ of the Einsteins of the world are probably in the range of 180, around there. The predictions of the supercomputers of the future, and the future being kind of between the year 2030 and 2050, so the not so distant future, are predicted to be in the range of the 12,000. So now a human brain of 180 IQ cannot compete in any real tangible way with an IQ of 12,000. And this is really where some of the people who are looking at AI development and seeing where it could potentially go is saying, let's try and proactively regulate and have kind of mechanisms in place, to ensure that we are still in control when we reach that stage of the supercomputer. And there's obviously the other side of the fence, which believe that this is all just a hoax. It's a lot of noise for nothing. And really, there's nothing to be afraid of. Robots are never going to take over. And, people are just kind of scaremongering you, from watching too many science fiction movies. So there's two real big camps when it comes to the development of AI. But even before we get to kind of that stage, I mean, just on a very basic level, the AI that we have today is already making decisions about people. So for me, that is really where we need to be focusing today. It's that we just feeding data into these algorithms, and then it's giving us some kind of answer, and we just following that answer blindly. And I think what Enrico said about human rights, that's really where human rights comes into play, because if those type of human rights elements are not embedded into the algorithm, discrimination and bias is very, very easy, because the computer is only as smart as the data that you feed it. And given bias in data sets, just human bias that we already know is out there. It could be completely unintentional, but we could have results that are highly discriminatory. And there's been so many examples that pop up almost on a daily basis. Just a few weeks ago, people were showing on Twitter, if you put a picture of two people in the same photo, Twitter, the algorithm is written in such a way that it will just show you the face of one person, so that it's easier, when you're looking on Twitter, to see what you're looking at. And almost 9 times out of 10, the algorithm puts the lighter skinned person above the darker skinned person if there's two people in a photograph. Now, Twitter did not set out to intentionally write the algorithm to do that, but because of the data that Twitter's now been trained with in the back end, which obviously contains some kind of bias, has resulted in this. So these human rights principles have to be entrenched in the way these algorithms are drafted. And we have such a powerful Bill of Rights, and we need to use it. And I think what Enrico said is quite important. The document, the 4-hour report, doesn't actually talk to those fundamental Bill of Rights. I'm a big fan of the Bill of Rights, and I think, we should go back there and see, what are these rights that we're supposed to be protecting, and then make sure that is taken with us all the way up and every step of the way. So those are some of the things when it comes to AI. AI Institute, I mean, we need more detail as to what they're going to do and what their purpose is. If it's just another institute with a nice name that's not really going to achieve much, don't really think it's important. If there's really going to be something useful coming out of the AI Institute, I'm definitely all for it, because AI is definitely a game changer, a piece of technology going forward.
Thank you for that, Nerushka. I think, you've put it so beautifully. It's almost the journey of AI from this kind of utilitarian type purpose all the way to this autonomous intelligence type being that we anticipate. And I think the regulatory journey must be coupled with that to see how we move from that kind of getting into the self-driving car all the way to something that is making these decisions for us, and also that need to preserve humanity. Sizwe, your reactions to that, what would you add, and what are your recommendations for how we perceive AI and how we regulate AI?
Thank you, Pria. There's two ways that one can look at AI. One can look at AI in terms of the international accepted norms, and I'm calling them norms because jurists all over the world are busy trying to develop what they call artificial intelligence norms. These are the norms that are supposed to then guide countries, our courts, in developing the common law to deal with aspects relating to AI. So that's the international forum and their approach. But I think from a South African approach and from a purely legal approach, correctly so, human rights must play a role. It's the supreme law. Aspects relating to access to the AI, aspects relating to the protection of the data produced by the AI, aspects relating to freedom of speech, how, for instance, bots could be used to express certain things in terms of freedom of speech. I mean, discrimination, like Nerushka correctly pointed out, to say, once you feed a computer certain information and once you ask it to compute certain things, you can actually use that data to start discriminating people. So from a human rights perspective, I fully agree with that. Then what one would call in America tort or delict, or colloquially so called liability. I think liability is very important when you're looking at your self-driving cars, when you're looking at the whole drone situation. This may sound like a very dry lawyer's joke, but I'm carefully waiting for the day where a client is going to walk into my office and say that a drone has fallen on his roof and he wants to sue the person who is working with that drone. I mean, that would be one of the most interesting tort/liability cases that I would do. So I'm waiting for that. If anyone has a drone falling on their roof, please, I'm available for that to do some interesting case law. So like I said, it's human rights, it's tort, and it's enforceability and validity of those decisions. In other words, in the ECT, we already have the regime dealing with automated transactions, a very rigid regime, a regime that still requires a lot of intermediary, intermediary involvement. It is not necessarily fully self-automated. So yes, maybe it is time to look at our legislature in terms of maybe developing a piece of legislation specifically dealing with AI and these aspects. Obviously, we can't rewrite human rights. So in terms of that, we'll have to look at the courts, how the courts will interpret human rights and AI. But I think in terms of tort and validity and enforceability of decisions or actions done by way of artificial intelligence, I think that is the area of the law where our legislature should maybe say, maybe we have reached that point now. After the ECT Act, which is now, 18 years ago, we have reached that point now where we need to develop a piece of legislation that directly speaks to AI and these legal aspects that I've just pointed you to. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sizwe. I love how you brought attention to just those fundamentals for the lawyers that are things like liability and enforceability, and also just going back to that fundamental aspect of the ECT Act, which says, I remember years ago, we used to call it the law of the future because we didn't know what it meant. When it spoke about automated processing and so on, we anticipated that was coming, but we just didn't know how it would be applied. And so, you know, a concept like attribution to originate. So what did that mean in the 2000s? But it means something now, and probably worth not just shelving that, but having a look at it, as you say, and trying to work out what we do with that, and if we need to update it. We're going into now the closing part of this, and I know that a lot of people coming into this discussion were really on the cusp of preparing their organization and preparing themselves for a response to the report. And so wondering if you, the panel, can share your thoughts with that community. They are from the private sector, civil society, academia, and so on. So with different interests in this report, what would be your recommendations to them in terms of how to unpack this report and work through it? Beyond having chats with you, what would be your recommendations to them in dealing with this report and getting closer to it and some of the structures? And should we start with Enrico? Let's start with Enrico.
Yes, thank you, Priya. I think we have discussed a number of these things already, right? How then to take forward all these recommendations. So for me, so the first one is to really try to have the preconditions in place in terms of connectivity and, you know, minimum baseline of legislation on data protection and cybercrime that we already have in South Africa, although it's not still fully operationalized yet. So to really try to speed up this process, because those are the necessary preconditions together with connectivity, so addressing issues of spectrum allocation and high demand spectrum, and also spectrum commons to try really to cover rural and perceived uneconomic areas, because that probably would provide, you know, the readiness that is needed to create the conditions for these emerging technology to thrive in South Africa. So probably, you know, this report does not cover extensively all these preconditions because they are really there. So maybe there should be a priority now for the commissioners, each and on in their own role, to really try then to implement and to operationalize some of these policy and legislation that is already in place. Probably, I think that should be the first objective. Secondly, there is a need of underpinning this entire report through a risk-based approach. This is the next step, because as we have seen, the report covers all the positive aspects that we will all expect from this, and it makes some specific recommendations on that, the AI Institute and others, but at the same time does not take into account the systemic risks that actually are emerging with technological innovation and disruptive technology. So I believe that the risk approach for the next kind of generation of rules, principles, and norms is necessary, and all actually then the commissioners can have, I think, a very important role to play there, because they, with their own expertise, can identify within their own specific sector what are the potential risks and threats. Something that has not been done so far, I've seen only in cybersecurity, but I think it can be applied also to other domains of tech law, is the foresight and scenario building exercise. Has been in the past, believed that actually we are not able to predict the future. That's true. Also, we can identify what the technology is promising from a positive point of view. So why not to create also then the negative scenario, actually what can happen, what can go really wrong, so that, the policy response try to achieve normally a middle way, because it's very difficult to try to achieve always the very positive one. So the report again covers all these futuristic, very positive aspects of emerging technology and innovation. I think at the same time we do need to identify what what can go wrong and what the negative aspects might be, so that policy intervention goes into the in the middle way. And then of course I do agree, I would like to echo again what Nerushka said on this human rights by design and the application of the Bill of Rights underpinning actually the fourth industrial revolution, to have now this component that is really trying then to provide the human-centric approach to the fourth industrial revolution, and I believe that then the developmental potential of all this innovation, it's actually really created simply because we meet people's rights to privacy, to safety and security, but also to work, and to do everything else that is enabled through technological innovation. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico. And Sizwe, from your side, recommendations for those that are reading this report for the first time, needing to respond to it.
Thank you, Pria. I always believe that documents or reports of this nature are documents that you can engage with. There is a lot of meaningful information in the report, a lot of knowledge being imparted to some of us who may be only legally inclined, and there are some technical issues that are really being discussed, matters that really affect everybody. So, for it not to sound like we were bashing the report, because we were not, the report really is useful. It was necessary because the fourth industrial revolution is a reality. We are living it right now in this forum. We are meeting virtually because of COVID, and because of the beauty of the fourth industrial revolution, we are able to meet virtually and have this meeting. So the fourth industrial revolution definitely is not something that should be put aside or forgotten about. I think from the private sector, it's something very useful. It will advise what is government's stance on the revolution itself. Whether government will be assisting people, ICTs in furthering the objectives thereof. And so from that perspective, I think it's a very useful tool, also for foreign investors who may want to come to South Africa. It really sets the stage to say, we are not in the old Africa. We're not in the colonial Africa, where Africa was completely disconnected from the world. We are now in the 2020 Africa. We are a role player, and we are definitely intent on using data to make things happen for us as a people. So for me, definitely, if you have the time to sit back, read the report, it's something worthwhile doing. Just be mindful of the criticisms that we've had today. Like I said, we were not bashing the report. It was criticisms, and I think that is what forums like this, like the one you've created here today, are for. And I think we should be very indebted to you, Pria, for going out there and for literally from a private sector perspective, going out there and saying, let us interrogate this report. Let's have a look at this report. Let's discuss this report. What is the relevance of this report? And how can we make it useful for ourselves? So one more cap for you on that one, Pria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sizwe. I definitely agree with you, especially what you said about me. I'm kidding. So no, but thank you for that, Nerushka. To bring it in on the closing comments. I'm also hoping that you can touch on the kinds of skills you would like to see for lawyers in the future. So, you know, the community of tech lawyers is growing, and hopefully even, you know, through our efforts, we're inspiring more young people to join the profession. But in speaking to this report, some recommendations for those that are interpreting it, private sector, public sector, but also for lawyers who are dealing with these issues for the first time. How do they skill up?
Thanks, Priya. So yes, I mean, upskilling of lawyers, of course, is like a personal passion of mine. And I do believe that although, you know, we will still have traditional lawyers in the future, I think the future also holds a whole lot of new opportunities for those with a legal background who want to take, if you know, if they choose. And that's what tech is really bringing to law. As the practice of law is changing, these opportunities also arise. But just in general, I think every single lawyer needs a basic understanding of tech. It doesn't matter if you're an insurance lawyer, a litigation lawyer, an aviation lawyer, whatever your particular background or skill set has been till today. Technology is really impacting every area of life. And I think if you look again at the 4IR report, you know, it's not written from a point of view of technology. It's written from a point of view of industry sectors, of energy, of agriculture. You know, it's coming from, you know, these traditional sectors that we've already had, and now applying technology on top of that and seeing what the implication of that is. So I really think if you believe that tech is not relevant to you because, you know, your expertise may lie elsewhere, or you don't believe you're a techie, I think you may be creating problems for yourself in the future. And I don't mean you need to be a technology expert. You just need to have a base level understanding of, you know, if somebody talks to you about the cloud, you know, you shouldn't look like a deer in headlights when you hear the word cloud, for example, or the word big data, or the word AI. You should be able to engage in at least conversation, understand what your client is doing in their business, because it's actually your responsibility to be able to give advice about their business. And if you don't even understand how their business is operating, you know, ethically, are you able to give advice to that person? We're living also in the information age. Knowledge is really so accessible. I think we're blessed with an abundance of knowledge. And this is obviously if you have access to the internet that I'm talking about, in terms of course content becoming freely available from, you know, any university in the world, as well as having engagements like this. You know, having good quality internet allows us to have, you know, these kind of video engagements with people. Doesn't matter where they're sitting in the world. And I think it's these type of things that you need to be proactive, because the information is out there. If you're not taking action and accessing that information and upskilling yourself in the relevant way, you know, it's only yourself to blame. Coming back to the report quickly, with regards to what I think could have also been expanded on, you know, the adoption rate of emerging tech, you know, the exponential growth and the speeds at which it's adopted wasn't really fleshed out. You know, they reference the World Economic Forum a number of times in the report, and I think the World Economic Forum does talk about this point quite a lot, but it wasn't carried over into the report. Two technologies that were maybe very light touch mentioned was quantum computing and nanotechnology. Maybe perhaps a little bit more research into those fields and more information about how the report engages there. When it comes to blockchain, they definitely acknowledge blockchain could have huge transformative potential. Again, I think this is a theme that we've mentioned earlier, is that they haven't acknowledged things that have already kind of in the process. So there is something called SANBAR, the South African National Blockchain Alliance, currently run out of the CSIR and funded by the Department of Science and Technology. SANBAR is looking to make South Africa kind of the African eco-center when it comes to blockchain development on the continent. Is quite an interesting development that you know, again, was silent upon. They do talk about recommendations regarding to intellectual property, which I think is quite important. You know, we have quite restrictive intellectual property laws, especially when it comes to the export of IP, that can cause roadblocks for a lot of companies trying to innovate. Again, labor laws were spoken about relating to immigration, and as well as restrictive labor laws that may hamper, or prevent people from really employing because of the strictness of those laws. And then also tax. I think exchange control has really affected a number of startups who want to receive investments from overseas. I know personally some startups who've really had a number of hurdles and red tape just to be able to receive offshore investment. So if we really want to grow the space, I think we do need to look at the prohibitive legislation and see where those changes can be made. And then looking forward, of course, being proactive for that. With regards to those on the call who want to make feedback, based on our engagement today, based on the chats, based on the comments, looking at the attendee list, I think we're just a crowd of experts here. We could have replaced any of us with any of the attendees and had the same discussion. Really, everybody's been exceptional. So I think everybody will have something to contribute to this report in terms of feedback and in terms of their thoughts, and also to help the Commission identify blind spots. We all come from our own little bubbles. As Sizwe said, we need to break those silos. The Commission obviously is seeing the world from this perspective, and we need to help them identify perhaps a few of the blind spots in the report. They do ask for feedback and consultation by the 30th of November. However, they don't really have a mechanism for how to receive that feedback. I don't know if anybody picked up an email address or anything else from the report, but I saw a date for feedback, but I didn't see how to give that feedback. So I don't know, Pria, if you had any more information, but I think, if you have comments and thoughts, do give the feedback. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that. I think from my side, there's not much more to add. I just get the sense from our discussion today that what we are doing is rallying for support for this initiative and for this endeavor. And I think, picking up on what Sizwe said, it isn't in the spirit of just ordinary criticism, but it's with a view to being constructive. So I think in that vein, what we are suggesting is that we do want to see agility. We do want to see responses and involvement. And we also do want to see that these are purposeful, that, we spoke quite a bit about operationalizing certain aspects and bringing in the detail. There are many participants here who are closer to the process in terms of the Commission and the report and the recommendations. And I will urge that you draw on the people not only that have attended today's event, but of course the panelists who have so generously shared their insights. Bring those willing minds closer to the process and benefit from the contributions that people are willing to make voluntarily. This is a joint initiative, and I hope to see many more that would really support for this. So with that, thank you so much to the panelists. Incredibly generous, incredibly insightful. My job was the easiest. I just asked the burning questions. So thank you all very, very, very much. And thank you to the attendees. As Nerushka said, exceptional participation, just so encouraging to see this level of participation and interest. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pria. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.